Well, Doris Duke.
Doris Duke, last week we were talking, Greg, about kind of the later stages, and is it okay to go ahead and start recording?
Yeah, but
That's recorded.
and I'll go any way you want. Just try to keep me on track.
Cool, and we'll keep it within an hour because we know the meeting coming up. Deborah, if in about 10 minutes before the hour, kind of give us the reminder, because you know how these storytellers are. They just don't know when to stop telling stories.
Time is forever.
I'll do my best, but
Exactly. Well, Greg, one of the things, Deborah and I were talking after the interview last week, and you shared so much amazing information with us in how the interviews that you conducted during these years really became part of different curriculum projects in Utah. And we wanted to get a little more information about that, if you could. We talked also a little bit about how that may or may not have been in the original plan of the project, but it kind of grew organically. Is that kind of correct?
It is very correct. It was I would call it a program and documentation generational growth approach. We just all of this is being conducted, developed, and managed out of the American West Center. And so, and the American West Center existed because of its own fundraising capabilities to underwrite most of the activities, much of the staffing, and forward movement. And so, and that was, as I'm sure you're well aware and probably experience firsthand day to day, fundraising is a wild business, and it can be quite stressful. So as we were coming out of the Duke grant period, meaning this would be 1972 late, and we had been talking for some time about where should we go, and there was a feeling in the history department faculty group, which was closely associated with the center, and with the dean of humanities at that time. The American West Center reported to the dean of humanities that there should be an effort to continue the American West Center forward. Initially, the American West Center was established about 1964, I believe, to produce a magazine, a historic magazine called The American West, that was one of two publications the newly founded Western History Association sponsored. They sponsored the Western History Quarterly, which still exists, and the American West. And about the time that the Duke people showed up with funding in hand, the decision had been made by the organization to move the American West publication to the West Coast into a situation in which a private publisher and Wallace Stegner were involved in and would be involved in publishing the American West. It went on for a few years and then eventually disappeared. So there was some overlap between publishing the West, which was neat for me because I got involved in some of that, got to see how that happened, had never been around publishing other than a little bit of newspaper publishing as a punk kid. And so So the idea was to try to keep the center going. And the real key here was Floyd O'Neill. Floyd was magical in his ability to think through fundable projects. And so when I talk about the generational idea, what I'm really referring to is the Duke Project opens up the oral history experience here in Utah, literally. There'd been some other efforts, but it really was a major force in introducing the medium as documentation capability to the community. And the first step out of that was to expand off of the Duke Project into documenting other ethnic groups in Utah and the labor immigrant groups, which were substantial in Utah, and they were all except for two were European: Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe. The two that were beyond that were the Japanese that came and the Chinese that came. Chinese came because of the Transcontinental Railroad. Some stayed. And in the 70s, we had a small productive community, mostly living in Salt Lake City. So funding was found. Floyd found some marginal funding to start doing some projects on the same framework as the Duke framework of production, with the same techniques and using the machinery and so forth. And almost all of that work was done by students. And I was involved in the center, and I was overseeing parts of those activities. And I was responsible for the transcribing side of the initiative in the office itself, and would go out and do some interviewing. That went on. That actually continues today. It's been expanded in multiple ways in the American West Center, still focused in the American West Center. Over the period of time, such experiences as individuals who attracted the polio disease were interviewed, and they were interviewed fairly recently. Part of that initiative was to get those people that were in their 70s, 80s, and looking at the returning issues related to having had polio. And that's a neat little project. And it's received quite a bit of attention. A huge effort was undertaken to document World War II veterans in our area. It was attached to the greater national effort, and I suspect you all may have had some of that activity. There were a lot of interviews, 500, 600, maybe 700 interviews were conducted, and it was done on a shoestring. I have found funding to have the transcriptions, to pay for the transcriptions, and then have the materials moved to the library and be cataloged into the collection. And because it's a more contemporary effort, was started in the 90s, late 90s, we've had better documentation. And in the early part of that, we didn't still see the exactness with which copyright issues would be defined by 2020. And in that time period, the addition of requiring signatures for the interviewer and the interviewee came into play. So some of that is still missing in the documentation. But I talked a little bit about the American Indian tribal projects that came out of it. We can do more of that if you think it's needed. We also were active in documenting the Great Salt Lake. I don't know if you've been in our area or not, but if you have or you come, you immediately notice the influence of the Great Salt Lake on Salt Lake City, in the Salt Lake Valley. Sits on the eastern edge of the Great Basin, and it's a dead lake. It has no outward drainage, despite what some of the early explorers choreographed in their documentation. We've also, let's see, what else has been, there have been other projects that have gone on. The one that we've spent a good deal of time, effort, and funding on recently is, and I think I may have mentioned this, is doing oral histories with women who are, whose experience has been the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. We have and this project has been sponsored out of the library. We have started what is called the Eileen Clyde 20th century American Women's Oral History and Archives project. So we have attracted manuscript related materials as well as conducted oral histories, and we have attracted motion image materials to go with it. And that's been, I'm biased because I push this agenda hard, but it's been quite successful. And as I had surmised in watching what was going on across the state had not been nearly as active as it should have been and should be in documenting women in the contemporary time period. And so that's an ongoing project, and Todd's been very active in that project from the library's viewpoint. So, and there have been various components of the American Indian Initiative. The more recent ones have been under the leadership of Greg Smoke, and he's worked a good deal with the national parks, using their money to document certain situations in Montana, in southern Utah, northern Arizona, around national park sites, and mostly related to Native American issues. And so I mentioned this is one of the best examples I think we have of how the Duke Project and the materials out of the Duke Project continue to be used over and over again. And that is, as I mentioned last time, the Utah American Indian Digital Archives with its own website, and it has materials directly documenting the 8 recognized tribes in Utah, 7 of which have reservation lands associated with their recognition. And that project, I'm hoping it will go a little, and then it kind of lies there, and the state history group and the Division of Indian Affairs, part of the state organization, are oversight of that. They don't know too much what to do with it, so every now and then we will step in and help refresh it. There's been redesign. The center has been involved directly in that. And we've built in curricula that for the various tribes that allows people, teachers doing social studies can pluck out specific types of curriculum development to just drop into their classes and use with virtually no development work on their part. It just
Greg, excuse me, who kind of facilitates that, the connection between the interviews and the classroom? Is there someone who's actually facilitating that, or is it kind of self-guided by now?
Well, it's heavily self-guided, although the community, we have a very robust History Day program in our state. I don't know if you do or not. And it's run through the state history office. Key person there runs the whole thing. That operation helps to direct students to our resources and the resources of state history, as well as the other academic institutions. So that helps to direct traffic into some of these websites and get use. But it's I think a lot of it is people get on, they Google in, and it's a self-discovery approach.
Wow.
And then they come asking for help, and some may get to the center, or they come to the library and get to special collections and our reference individuals. And so it's multifaceted, I believe. Todd probably has a much better idea on this. He's directly involved in the reference duties and sees it day to day. But the other project I'd like to mention that we've done, it's built off the same paradigm that we took out of the Duke project, applied it to the tribal history projects. And this is a project that has worked to digitize the efforts of the professional architectural community in Utah, and actually the pre-professional, because you don't see the rise of a formal professional group until about the teens in the 20th century. And we've gone through and identified, we've done this with the Utah Architectural Association and their foundation, a little help from the state history and our own efforts here at the special collections. So we've built what you might call a Wikipedia program on the leading architects for the state of Utah, their projects. We have a biographical section, and we've included images, and we're hoping that particular project might begin to use develop technology, GIS, and other things to expand the way in which you present not only the architect, but the projects, including, if this gets pulled off correctly, you would see the outside and the inside of the projects done. And it has that particular project has some interest in College of Architecture here on campus. And it has, we've been working with the Association of Architects for Utah. They have an educational week. And so we've been working to build this into their educational program to make it a more third dimension styled initiative. And one of the projects that we developed that absolutely came out of the Indian track was, and it came out of Duke almost directly by the experience had in Duke, and that is I pushed very hard to develop a Western Waters digital archives. Water in our neck of the woods is slightly more precious than plutonium. And what I found in working with the tribes and doing the tribal histories and started picking this up during the oral histories in Duke is that the tribes are constantly battling for natural resource rights or the protection of those rights. And I, coming from my archivist bonnet and history uniform, watched tribes spend millions of dollars continually to reinvent the wheel for the protection or the legal rights of their own natural resources. And water was a big one. We're talking the Western tribes. And the then director of the library was part of the starting of the Greater Western Library Alliance, which exists today, GWILA, you may have heard of it. And she talked GWILA into providing startup funding to take this idea and move it forward. And it developed off 4 river basins, the Platte that comes out onto the plains, the Rio Grande in southern, southwestern United States, the Columbia, and the Colorado. And that project went on. It still exists, although it's fairly dormant. We hosted it here, drove it for a decade or so, and under new leadership and the recession depression that we had in the teens was seen as we were unable to support it, and it was moved to Oregon State, where they have some special capabilities in doing that. I haven't done too much with it. Still exists, and I still think that it needs to be out there as a mega website. We don't understand water well. Our constituency and our public do not understand, even in a very minimal way, what water is in the West. And we had worked quite hard putting the legal concept together, the historical concept, and so forth and so on. So it's been a fun avocation for me. I like studying water history. It's part of my bag of being a historian. So those are the trails. And what you can see, I think, Paul, that's important is that the paradigms are developed very early, and they come out of Duke. And even though the subjects are a bit generationally remote from American Indian, almost all of them have a sense of American Indian in them somewhere. There are threads.
Right.
And even in the architectural efforts with the tribes is something that gets picked up in the description. And so I see it in the long view as, so here's what the Duke Project generated. First and foremost, it is a magnificent set of interviews documenting American Indian history from the view of the Indian citizen themselves. And my dog wants you to know he's still alive.
All right.
And and so I see the bigger picture, and I also see, and I hope we have a chance to talk about this, that the Duke, the Global Duke Project absolutely influenced the Oral History Association and the huge jump in the practice of oral history across this country and in Canada.
That's a great point, Greg, because even in my years of involvement with the council and many different committees and OHA, and then even as president, to be honest with you, I don't recall, except maybe one or two occasions, where anyone really ever mentioned the Duke Native American History Project. I mean, Deborah could correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, it's amazing how that appeared to kind of somehow go out of memory. Or
it did. I'll tell you my view of it, because I was involved. I think I went to my first conference in '68.
Okay.
Or '69, and Floyd would always find some money to get me to the conferences so I could go. He went. Crampton didn't go very much, but and in those early years, the group of people that were driving the association and building it, because it was quite young, were senior historians and people who came from some other areas, other disciplines, mostly academics. And there was, at the same time, you're also dealing with the longer tail of the rise of civil rights. And we've had such a wonderful review of the 60s and the 70s period in our contemporary times here, kind of put a lot of that memory back on the stage. And so the documentation of ethnic groups and the building of tribal archives and other things is embedded as a thread. Not as a big one, but as a thread in the oral history. But you're absolutely right. By the end of the 70s, there was very little discussion that went on when I was at the Oral History Associations. And I basically stopped going. I think the last one I went to probably was 83 or 4, 85, somewhere in there. And I stopped. It's an expensive association to belong to, in the sense of going to their conferences, or it was then. They were all kind of in fun places to go that were tourist oriented.
Okay.
And
parenthetically, Greg, we've changed since then. We like to get you back in because, in fact, our council made the decision years ago, after the period that you're talking about, but in direct kind of, what's the term, a response. So we only choose now what are known as tier 2 or tier 3 cities to hold our conferences in, because so much the effort in the early 2010s especially was made to recruit non-academics, like so-called, say, K through 12 teachers, independent museum folks. And the realization was that we can no longer afford to go to cities like Chicago or San Francisco or, fun as those may be. So now we go to places like Tampa and Baltimore. And the year I was president, we went to Madison. We got an incredible deal on the hotel. So yeah, we've actually, we're trying to learn from that earlier understanding that. I mean, some of our academic associations, as you know, like the AHA, American Historical Association, is really, they'll have the conference in DC or San Francisco, and you have to spend like $300 a night for a hotel. It's just unreal.
Yeah. And even that rate was going away fast before the virus hit. The Oral History Association was here a year ago
Yeah.
in October and held their core conference at Snowbird, a ski resort close to the city. Floyd and I hosted the Oral History Association to the same location it was in the 1970s sometime. And so we were local arrangements, and it was a lot of fun. We had a great time, and I think everybody had a good time. But and I can't remember who was president that year, but the last year I had wanted to go, but it came at the same time as the Western History Association, which has often been the case. Those two lie over the top of each other quite often. And so it was another reason I had to make a choice. I couldn't do both. And
Right.
Even if they were slightly off on dates, trying to fund it all was challenging. And so, but I've watched the journal and kind of trying to keep track and stay up with what's going on in the association, because I have always felt it was an important force from an archival librarian sense, it's an important source of creating new documentation.
Yeah. And certainly I know the Southwestern, SOHA, the Southwestern Oral History Association, has done really good work as well.
Yeah.
Greg, one of the things I wanted to ask you, and you've told a really compelling story about the impact of the Duke Project, Native American history, and how that's really in many ways informed, so much of your professional work and our archival and oral history projects. Can you go back and was there any, after that initial contact between the folks that came out and get the project started, the funding has started, what kind of communication did you all have early on with Doris Duke? I realize it wasn't the big foundation it is now, but in terms of how we would say, like accountability or reports, or can you kind of talk about that?
A little bit. I never met Doris Duke, and I don't know that anybody else did. Maybe Crampton did. He might have been the one because he was responsible for the overall administration. Doris Duke, and remember, it's her private money that's funding all this at that time. There was no Doris Duke Foundation, unless her father had put something together, but there was nothing under Doris Duke as a foundation. And so we were always told to be careful to identify the funding as her private funding sources. And she had a representative, and I have the impression, but I haven't checked the documentation on this, that it was somebody who was an attorney who probably worked with her and her whole financial situation. And that individual would be involved, and I think made the rounds some. He certainly came out a time or two to Utah. And I'm certain, I wasn't involved in this, but I'm certain that Greg Crampton was communicating with him. I know we all did an annual report, and I don't know if you have in your files anywhere any remnants of those annual reports, but I believe everybody was asked to present the annual report, and I'm guessing that's what Greg Crampton used when he put together the overall achievement of the funding in the 5-year period. So I can't tell you a lot. I just remember it was stress time when that person was due. Mm-hmm. And there was also a lot of push at the end of each year. And I I just assume it was the calendar year was the fiscal cycle, because it had been started so close to January 1, 1967. And it ends in 72,
Right.
at the end of the year. And I think most people carried into 73 a bit, kind of shutting everything down, closing it up. I have an interesting story. Probably shouldn't put this on tape, but we will. Here at Utah, my predecessor was Dr. Everett Cooley, and he was quite a force in National Archive development, not the National Archives, the government institution, but the development of a national archival group and activity, and certainly was the father of archival efforts here in the state. So when, I think this was in 73, when everything was complete and we had boxed it the way we had bound it the way we did and so forth, and we were all closed, and I'm sure the money was all spent. So Greg called Ev. They knew each other. They were in the history department together. They were both Berkeley trained historians, and said, we're ready to turn the Doris Duke American Indian oral interviews and archives over to you. And Ev said, I don't want them.
Wow.
And
okay.
Yes, and the reaction was exactly like you did. And I wasn't around, but I'm certain that Greg Crampton probably darn near dropped the phone.
Wow.
Because this project had been talked about quite a bit, on campus in the area, and in those days, to generate a couple $100,000 in humanities was a big deal. That was a lot of money coming into humanities, and so Greg puts the phone down, picks it back up, calls the president, who happened to be Dr. Fletcher, who on two different occasions was director of Nassau, and said what had gone on, and said, would you do something? And Fletcher puts the phone down, picks it up, calls Ev, and pretty soon I'm trotting down the hill, because we were located above the library, with some of this stuff, bringing it to the library. And, to Ev's benefit, he not only learned to embrace all of that, but he retired. That was how I got here. And for about 10 years, he did oral history on the history of the university and in the community. And we worked together quite closely. And together we raised the money to do that. And so he became a real fan of oral history. And I think he thoroughly enjoyed the whole experience. He was certainly a wonderful copy editor in the process of getting transcripts ready for submission. He had been director of the State History Society, and had been the chief editor, publisher of the Utah Historical Quarterly during his period. And so
we have the same challenges here, Greg, over the decades, that we could learn from Sam Proctor. And it's not surprising that initially there's a question, where's all this stuff going to go, right?
Yeah.
Because at that time, it's brand new. Like, what do you want me to do with it, kind of thing, right?
Yeah. And I'm sure others. I'll bet that Sam at North Dakota or South Dakota had some of the same issues. I didn't talk to him too much about that, but it's newness and it's change, and it's a different kind of documentation system, and you have different issues you deal with, and that all of that plays. So again, it's in that generational sense of how it changes standards and requirements, conservation. Once you take in 2,000 or 2,500 tapes that are either open reel or cassette, now you got to preserve them.
Exactly.
And one thing that Evan and his staff did very well was every 6 months to a year, they would rewind a couple thousand tapes as a preservation tool. And we're still using some of those tapes. And that's probably the reason why, was that tender care and maintenance has extended the life. And certainly the other advantage, I think, the Marriott had, how do I put this? That sounds poorly the way I started that. When I came to the library in '83, I understood all of the oral history collections that we had. I'd been involved in a lot of them being created, and I certainly had been involved in Duke. And so by pure instinct, and people knew that. I mean, it was clearly understood. So the attention generally given to the collection was very prominent, and the collections are not easy to reference, even if you've gotten the best of systems. They're challenging, and how to help patrons use the audio and the transcripts. Until we got digital technology moving forward, we just had a tape, and you played the tape if they wanted to hear it. And a lot of families have come wanting to hear Grandpa and Grandma and Great Grandpa, and they want to hear them in Navajo or Ute or Apache or Shoshone, whatever, Goshu. And so all of that is quite a change for special collections and archival holding repositories in how they present that material to the patron.
Yes, it is a big change. Well, one or two institutional questions, Greg, because we talked last week, about Sam Proctor's endeavors here at UF, and I think you read the sequences where Sam was talking about, in many ways, there's a parallel story here between the University of Florida and the University of Utah, where Sam really, in the early years, it's not clear how many allies he had here on campus. Actually, not many. Over time, that changes.
That's my sense.
Yeah. But then he has, I think he gives us a strong sense that the Doris Duke Native American History Project was really what helped him build the oral history program at the University of Florida, right?
Yeah. I think I picked that up in your interview with him very, very clearly. It brought back those memories of discussions that went on between Floyd and Sam and Bessie and myself. There are some other details. I don't know if you'd want to take the time. I remember Sam talking about the roles he had played at the University of Florida in the community leading up to the Duke, and then after, because we would meet in the decade of the 70s and 80s, we often were together at different times in different places, and he would talk, and he talked about his role as, I think, editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly.
Yes.
And directing the Florida Historical Society. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Am I correct?
Yeah.
And that he also was involved with the Natural History Museum or the History Museum on campus.
had an office there. Exactly. Yeah.
And then I told you the story of developing the Jewish or Hebrew collection for the library. And that was he just went out and found the money. I was astounded. You know, he's a lot like Floyd O'Neill. What differentiates him from Floyd is he had a keen sense of going to the community to raise money. Virtually all the projects that were funded in the American West Center that Floyd were involved in have federal or state resources somewhere in the mix.
Right.
And very little of it is corporate or private. We had one project where we documented the uranium industry in the greater far southwestern territory, so Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, some in Nevada. And that was an oral history project. That's another, the paradigm comes directly out of Ute. It's like the industry of uranium was a tribe.
Wow.
And
Okay.
the oral interviews were conducted vertically through the whole industry, from the top leadership down to the guy driving the truck and picking the side of a vein. That had a Union Carbide grant, all of $5,000. God, we thought we'd died and gone to heaven when that came. And that was in the 70s. That was a joint project conducted with Cal State Fullerton and Gary Shumway. I don't know if you've heard, might have heard, Gary was very involved in oral history. He was a faculty member there in history. So in a lot of ways, O'Neill and Proctor are parallel people, and it was fun to be with them when they got together. Because both of them are good storytellers, very good storytellers, and they're action dudes. You know, they go do things,
right,
and they find ways to do it. And it was so much fun to listen to Sam tell the story of the experience of getting his way. Essentially, that's what it always came down to. Here's what I did, and this is how I did it, and this is what I got. And he had a marvelous way of telling it. For a native New Yorkan, he had that wonderful hospitality sense of a Southerner.
Yeah. When you had the chance to talk to Sam about the kind of parallel projects, and we'll wrap up. I think we have about 10 minutes left. When kind of thinking about the Oral History Association, Greg, and you would talk to Sam and Bessie, and there would be groups of folks. Did you talk more about? Were there any other talks about possible collaborations, or was it kind of more kind of you all were kind of fellow travelers, kind of sharing experiences back and forth?
Well, there was a lot of that, and I was trying to think. Willa Cather, did you meet? Not Willa Cather. Willa, what was Willa's last name? Baum.
Oh yes, yeah. Will Baum.
That developed the regional oral history. There were people like that. There was a woman at Penn State that was doing labor history, a lot of labor history stuff. I can't remember her name. There are individuals like that sprinkled all over that were part of the Oral History Association, very active part of it. And at one time or another, almost everybody was president and so forth and so on. And there was a lot of informal discussion about sharing, and there were formal presentations. A lot of the agenda was wrapped around talking about projects. And there was some methodology discussions, but it was, I think if you went back and looked at those agendas for the early years, it was doing this project and doing that project. I can't remember who came from Columbia. There were several people, but they always came, they were like royalty because they were the big dog on the street.
Right.
And
Louis Starr.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Say that name again. I missed part of it.
Professor Starr, like Louis Starr.
Louis Starr. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was, I mean, he was, and he was truly a gentleman. And they were doing things. They had been doing things a long time. Comminger. I think Nevins, Alan Nevins was involved at some point.
Yeah.
You know, at some point, I don't know, 15 years ago, I stopped and thought about all those people that were around, and you look at the level of production that they've had and their involvement, not only in oral history, but multiple threads of history. It's pretty amazing. And that, we got to know Alvin Josephi. Does that name ring a bell with you?
Alvin Josephi, I'm not sure.
Josephi was a very interesting person and the nephew of Alfred Knopf.
Wow.
And Sam talks about Alfred Knopf being at Arrowhead. And he came to several of those early oral history conferences that were in the East. And Alvin at one point ran American Heritage publication. He was a Time reporter. He was a historian for the Army in World War II. He was in the Pacific primarily. An amazing guy, and could write like you can't believe. Did all kinds of publications. He was on our national board, advisory board for the American West Center when it had one for a period of time in 68, 69, 70, 71, in that time period. And I got to know him because of that and because of Floyd, and actually had ongoing activities with Alvin for 20 years or 25 years. For a young punk, it was an amazing experience to sit at the foot of Alvin. Alvin knew everybody in the Indian world.
Wow.
Among other worlds like Sirius International Publishing and the world of Time magazine and on and on and on. And he wrote, his publications on Indian related topics are still critical. He wrote the book on the Nez Perce. And still, I think it came out in the early 60s or mid 60s or somewhere. It's still the go-to work on Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce. Big thick thing. My God, it's got to be 700 pages or something like that. He wrote a history of the House of Representatives. He wrote one I learned the other day. I had no idea. He did a Middle East topic, blew me away. Had never seen that title. Thought I knew all of his works. And when the tribal groups and the individuals were pushing their rights in 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, and you lead up to Wounded Knee, number 2, and you have the taking over of the BIA building in Washington, D.C. He's involved in writing, he wrote a major white paper for, I don't know which interior director it was, but it was one of them, trying to help find common ground and threads that would bring people together peacefully. It's a wonderful thing. It's called Red Power. sometime pick it up and look at it. It's an amazing document.
Cool.
And Alvin was one of those people met along the way of coming out of Duke that for me was a very influential individual. I don't think he really realized what he was doing, but he really mentored me significantly in that period. And he certainly made me a much better historian.
Excellent. Well, Greg, I know we're at our 1 hour. So and I know there's preparation for the next meeting. I want to give you a break too, because we've been talking quite a while. Now, given the fact that you all are, we're all reopening in the next week and a half, maybe we could do kind of our third session a bit later in September when
you just call the time. I'll try to clear the board, and you may have drained me, so think about what you want to hear more about, and okay. I'll think the same. I keep remembering these projects we did, which I think are sequential and thread related to Doris Duke. So you hear me tying that all together a lot.
Okay, well, and I appreciate that, Greg, and you give us so much to work with. And so now, and also Deborah and Todd may have questions too. And so we'll kind of use between now and kind of mid-September, okay. You know, if there's things you want to talk more about, if there's Deborah and Todd, if you have questions, we'll kind of put those together and go for session number 3.
I may call you to talk over how you are directing your proposal to Duke.
Yes, please do.
I think Todd and I may have had somewhat of a breakthrough yesterday. We were discussing this topic, and I've been befuddled a little bit on how to present it. But I think our staff have been thinking about this and what's needed. They're closest to the collection, and we're beginning to get a clear. I'm beginning to get a clearer picture. Maybe they already always had it, but anyway, I'd be real interested in just sharing with what we're thinking about and what you're thinking about, because I think your collection, you may be driving the Cadillac version of Doris Duke collections, quite frankly, Paul. And I think that your funding will be refinement I think, in a fairly delicate way.
Okay. Well, yeah, Deborah. Deborah has really been leading the organizational side of that, and so
yeah.
Maybe the 3 or 4 of us can talk about that. At any point, just let us know. We can set up another Zoom call to just talk about that.
I'd love for Todd to be involved, and we just kind of brainstorm.
Deborah, do you mind go ahead and actually sending Greg and Todd the earlier on in the spring, who is it from the Duke Foundation who did?
There were several people. Perfect. Actually.
Laura Marshall, Deborah, did a report. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we can send you that report that was done in our collections, because that might help you get a sense for how they, on the outside kind of looked in. We can also talk and share, Deborah, maybe even in some of the Evening with Elders programs with Greg and Todd. That's our collaboration with the Porch Band of Creek Indians, which is really the most active collaboration that we have. I think we mentioned it when we had our national consortium meeting. So yeah, any materials we can share, we will just, yeah. But Deborah will go ahead and send that document, and you can kind of see the Duke Foundation's assessment of how the collections were, looking from their perspective.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. All right, y'all. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Be well. Be safe now. Have a good day.